Emily sat alone in her home, surrounded by silence. The house, once filled with laughter and love, now felt like an empty shell. She gazed at the photographs on the walls, each one a reminder of the happy moments she had shared with her husband, Adam. They had been married for 6 years, and it seemed like the future was full of promise. But that future had been shattered in an instant. Adam had died suddenly in a car accident, and Emily hadn't been prepared for the devastation that would follow. The days after his death blurred together, as if she were living in a fog. Each morning she woke up with a deep heaviness in her chest, the kind of pain that never seemed to go away. The grief was consuming, overwhelming her thoughts and actions, making it hard to even get out of bed some days. She would stare out of the window, watching the world go by. But she felt disconnected from it all. She had tried to keep herself busy working, running errands, and talking to friends, but nothing seemed to help. Everyone around her moved on with their lives. But Emily felt as though she was stuck in a place she couldn't escape. Her friends often called, offering support, but their words felt empty. They didn't understand the depth of her pain, and, in some ways, she didn't expect them to. How could they? They hadn't lost their partner, their love, their life's companion. For Emily, it was as though the world had stopped turning. The days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. But time did nothing to ease the ache in her heart. She tried to be strong, to push through. But the emptiness inside her grew larger each day. She had become a ghost of her former self, moving through life without purpose, just going through the motions. One afternoon, Emily found herself sitting on the front porch of their house, the place where she and Adam used to sit together in the evenings, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. She remembered how he'd hold her hand, telling her that no matter what happened, they would always have each other. She could still feel the warmth of his hand in hers. And for a moment, it felt like he was still there beside her. But the moment passed, and the pain returned. She wiped away a tear and stood up, feeling the need to escape, to get away from the house that held so many memories. The quiet was too much to bear. She needed to breathe, to feel something outside of the sadness that had consumed her for so long. Without thinking, Emily walked off the porch and down the road, heading toward the open fields that stretched out beyond her house. The walk was long and aimless, but that was what she needed, a chance to clear her mind and maybe find some peace. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the landscape. The wind rustled through the tall grass, and Emily breathed in the fresh air, letting it fill her lungs. It felt good, almost like a release. She walked for what felt like hours, not caring where she was going, just needing to be away from everything. The world was so big, and she felt so small, so insignificant. It was like her grief had become a weight on her shoulders, making everything feel heavier. As the evening grew darker, Emily found herself in a quiet, isolated part of the countryside. She wasn't sure where she was anymore, but it didn't matter. She sat down on a large rock, looking out over the vast expanse of land. The sound of the wind and the distant calls of birds filled the air, and for a brief moment, she didn't feel so alone. The world was still moving, still turning, and maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to move with it. But then, as she sat there, the reality of her situation hit her again. She was alone. Adam was gone, and she had no one to turn to. The thought made her chest tighten, and she buried her face in her hands, letting the tears come. She cried for Adam, for the life they would never have, for the future that had been stolen from her. She cried for the loneliness that seemed to follow her everywhere. As the tears slowed, Emily heard a sound in the distance, a voice. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a rugged look that seemed to fit perfectly in the landscape. He wore a cowboy hat and boots, the kind of man who seemed comfortable in the wide open spaces of the countryside. He paused when he saw her, and for a moment, They just stared at each other, unsure of what to say. Emily quickly wiped her eyes, embarrassed that a stranger had seen her in such a vulnerable state. "Are you all right?" the man asked in a deep, steady voice. Emily nodded, wiping away the last of her tears. "I'm fine," she said, though the words didn't feel true. The man studied her for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe her or not. He could see the sadness in her eyes, the same kind of sadness he had seen in himself not so long ago. "You sure?" he asked again, stepping closer. Emily gave a small, sad smile. "I guess I just needed to get away for a while." The man nodded, understanding. He had been there himself, though it had been a long time ago. He had lost someone he loved, too, and it had taken him a long time to heal. But he had learned that sometimes all it took was a little time and space to begin to find a way out of the darkness. "Sometimes it helps to be alone for a while," he said. "But don't let yourself stay lost for too long. The world's still out there." Emily looked up at him, surprised by his kindness. She didn't know why, but something about this man seemed different. There was a calmness about him, a quiet strength that made her feel as though, maybe, just maybe, she could begin to feel better too. "My name's Jake," he said, extending a hand. "I live not too far from here." "Emily," she replied, shaking his hand. They stood there for a moment, both of them feeling the weight of the world on their shoulders, but neither of them speaking. It wasn't until the sound of the wind picked up again that Emily realized how cold it had become. "I should get going," she said, standing up from the rock. "Let me walk you back to your place," Jake offered. "It's getting dark, and you shouldn't be out here alone." Emily hesitated for a moment, but then, without a word, she nodded. As they walked together, she felt a small flicker of comfort, something she hadn't felt in so long. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she didn't feel completely alone. They didn't talk much on the way back, but Emily found herself grateful for Jake's presence. He didn't ask about her past or her grief. He simply walked beside her, offering her the quiet support she desperately needed. By the time they reached her house, the sky had darkened, and the stars were beginning to appear. Emily looked up at the sky, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over her. Maybe the world wasn't as empty as she had thought. "Thanks for walking with me," Emily said, turning to Jake. "I appreciate it." Jake smiled, tipping his hat. "Anytime." As Emily walked inside her house, she felt something stir within her. It wasn't the end of her grief, but it was a small step, a step toward healing, and toward finding a way to live again. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next few days seemed to drag by for Emily. Despite the brief moment of comfort she had found in Jake's company, the weight of her grief had returned, as heavy and suffocating as ever. She had spent the days following their encounter trying to get back to some sense of normalcy, but it felt like an impossible task. The house was still too quiet. The memories of Adam still too painful. Every room seemed to whisper of him, of the life they had built together, and it made Emily feel even more isolated. But something had shifted in her. The conversation with Jake, his calm presence, had left a mark on her. For the first time in a long time, Emily didn't feel completely alone. She had found herself thinking about him more than she expected. His quiet strength, the way he had listened without judgment, the kindness in his eyes, it was different from anything she had encountered in a long time. It was a reminder that not all people were wrapped up in their own worlds, oblivious to the struggles of others. There was a genuine kindness in Jake, something that drew her in, though she wasn't sure if she was ready to let herself get too close to anyone again. Still, the thought of him lingered. The memory of his gentle words and the way he had stayed by her side for that short walk back to her house made her feel less burdened. She wasn't sure why, but she found herself wishing she could talk to him again. It wasn't just the comfort he had given her, it was the fact that he didn't try to fix her. He didn't offer any solutions or empty words. He simply let her be. And that, more than anything, had felt like the relief she needed. One evening, about a week after their first meeting, Emily decided to take another walk. The weather was warmer than usual, with the sun beginning to set in the distance, casting a golden glow over the landscape. She felt the pull of the open land again, the need to be outside, away from the walls of her house. This time, however, as she walked, she didn't feel quite so lost. The fresh air filled her lungs and, for the first time in days, she didn't feel weighed down by the crushing sadness she had been carrying. As she walked, her thoughts drifted back to Jake. She wasn't sure why he had stayed with her that day. He had no obligation to comfort her, no reason to listen to her cry. But he had. And it had meant something. It made her wonder about him. What had brought him to the countryside? What was his life like? Was he as lonely as she felt? Without realizing it, she found herself walking in the direction of Jake's cabin. She had never been to his home before, but somehow, she felt like it was the right place to be. Maybe it was the pull of the quiet. The same kind of solace she had found in her brief encounter with him. Whatever it was, Emily found herself standing at the edge of his property, looking at the small cabin in the distance. The light inside was dim, and she hesitated, unsure of whether she should just turn around and leave. But as if on cue, the door to the cabin opened, and Jake stepped out onto the porch. He was dressed in his usual rugged clothes, his cowboy hat perched on his head, looking every bit the part of the solitary figure she had met before. When he saw her standing there, he paused for a moment, as if surprised to see her. "Emily," he called out, his voice soft but clear across the space between them. She froze, feeling a sudden rush of nervousness. It was strange to see him again after their last meeting, especially after so much time had passed. But there was something about him that made her feel like she could trust him. Something that made her feel like she wasn't as alone as she thought. "Hi, Jake," she called back, forcing a small smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Jake shook his head and took a few steps toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel beneath him. "Not at all," he said. "Was just finishing up some work inside. What brings you out this way?" Emily hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain her sudden urge to visit him. "I was just walking, thinking, I guess." Jake raised an eyebrow, his expression softening. "It's easy to get lost in your own thoughts out here. I know the feeling." Emily nodded, feeling a sense of relief at his understanding. "Yeah, it's like, sometimes, it's hard to escape your own mind. The quiet is nice, but also a little overwhelming sometimes." Waith. Jake glanced at the ground for a moment, clearly considering her words. Then, he looked back up at her, his gaze steady. "I get it. If you'd like, you can come in for a bit. It's nothing fancy, but I can offer a seat and a warm drink." Emily felt an unexpected warmth in his offer. There was something genuine about Jake that made her feel welcome, as though his invitation wasn't out of obligation, but simply because he wanted her to feel comfortable. Without thinking much about it, she nodded. "All right," she said. "I'll take you up on that offer." As they walked together toward the cabin, Emily couldn't help but notice how peaceful the surroundings were. The cabin was nestled in a quiet corner of the countryside, surrounded by trees and open fields. It was the kind of place she had always imagined a cowboy would live. A place where the world seemed far away, where time slowed down, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. Jake opened the door for her, and Emily stepped inside. The warmth of the cabin greeted her immediately. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a cozy glow on the room. There was a small kitchen to the side, with an old-fashioned wood stove, and the simple furnishings gave the place a rustic charm. It wasn't fancy, but it had an inviting feel, just the kind of place Emily could imagine herself staying in if she ever needed to escape. Emily calls. Emily calls. Make yourself comfortable, Jake said as he moved to the stove to prepare the drinks he had promised. I'll grab us some coffee. It's the least I can do after dragging you all the way out here. Emily smiled again, her nerves beginning to settle. She found a spot by the fire and sat down, looking around the room. It was peaceful. A far cry from the emptiness she had felt in her own house. There was something grounding about the simplicity of the space, and it made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could find some peace here, too. As Jake brought over the coffee, they settled into an easy conversation. They didn't talk about the past much, about Emily's grief, or Jake's own history. Instead, they spoke about the land, about the changing seasons, about life in the countryside. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt like she could breathe again. The world didn't feel so heavy, and she didn't feel so burdened by her sadness. It was a small moment, but it was one that she would hold on to for a long time. As the evening wore on, the storm clouds that had been gathering in the sky began to roll in, bringing with them a gentle rain. The sound of the rain hitting the roof added to the peaceful atmosphere, and Emily felt a sense of calm that had eluded her for so long. She was no longer alone in the world, at least not in this moment. And for the first time in a long time, that thought felt comforting. Jake, sitting across from her, watched her carefully. His eyes, gentle but observant. He could tell that Emily was still carrying a heavy weight, but he also saw that she was beginning to let it go, little by little. In his own way, he understood her pain, having been there once before. Maybe, just maybe, they could help each other find a way out of the darkness. The evening that Emily spent at Jake's cabin felt different from any other she had experienced in months. For the first time in a long while, she felt like herself again, or at least, a version of herself that wasn't defined entirely by grief. There was something about the cabin, the warmth of the fire, and the soft sound of the rain outside that made her feel safe. She had been so used to feeling lost, to feeling overwhelmed by sadness. But in Jake's presence, the weight seemed to lift, even if just for a moment. Jake, too, seemed at ease. He didn't press her for details about her life, didn't ask too many questions about her husband or her grief. Instead, they spoke of simpler things, the changing seasons, the beauty of the land, and even the funny little things that had happened around the town. It was refreshing to talk about something other than loss, and as they shared stories, Emily began to laugh more freely, a sound that had been missing from her life for so long. She hadn't realized how much she missed laughing until the sound bubbled up from deep inside her. Something so natural, so easy, and yet so foreign now. As the evening went on, the rain continued to fall softly outside, the storm moving in slowly but steadily. The cabin was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the chill of the world outside. Emily sat in the worn chair by the fire, wrapped in a blanket that Jake had given her, feeling a strange sense of comfort in this place. She couldn't quite explain it, but there was something about being here, away from the reminders of her loss, that made her feel lighter, more at peace. Jake had gone to the kitchen to check on something, and Emily was left alone for a few minutes. She stared into the flickering flames, her mind wandering back to Adam. She had loved him deeply. They had built a life together, shared hopes and dreams for the future, and in a moment, all of that had been ripped away. Emily had spent so many days crying over the loss, replaying memories of their time together, asking herself if there had been something she could have done to save him. But deep down, she knew there was no answer. He was gone, and nothing could bring him back. Tears began to well up in her eyes again, and she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to fall back into the sorrow she had been trying so hard to escape. She didn't want to feel like this anymore. The sadness was suffocating, and she hated how it made her feel weak. But in that moment, Alone with her thoughts, she couldn't help but mourn the life she had lost. Just as the tears began to fall, Jake returned, holding a steaming cup of tea in his hands. He didn't say anything at first. He simply sat down next to her, placing the tea on the table between them. He didn't ask if she was okay or if something was wrong. He just sat there, quiet, waiting. And for Emily, that was enough. She didn't need words right now. She just needed someone who understood the silence. Jake's presence was steady. A quiet support that allowed Emily to feel like she didn't have to explain herself, didn't have to justify the emotions swirling inside her. She could simply be. And for the first time in so long, that felt like a gift. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The sound of the rain hitting the roof, the crackling of the fire, and the occasional gust of wind outside made the atmosphere feel almost dreamlike. Emily took a deep breath and let the tears flow freely. She hadn't cried like this in front of anyone in so long, but she wasn't ashamed. Jake didn't seem uncomfortable either. He simply watched her, his expression calm, his eyes filled with understanding. When the tears slowed, Emily sniffled and wiped her face with the back of her hand, feeling a little embarrassed but also strangely relieved. She glanced at Jake, expecting him to say something, to offer words of comfort or advice, but he didn't. Instead, he picked up the cup of tea from the table and handed it to her without a word. She took it gratefully, holding it in her hands as the warmth spread through her palms. It was comforting, in its own way, to know that she didn't have to talk, that she didn't have to explain everything that was happening inside her. Jake wasn't trying to fix her. He was simply allowing her to feel whatever she needed to feel. "Thank you," Emily whispered, her voice still shaky. Jake nodded, giving her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me." The words weren't much, but they meant everything in that moment. She felt seen, understood, and not judged. It was a rare and precious thing to feel that way when you were grieving, when you felt so lost and broken. She didn't know why Jake had shown up in her life when he did, but she was grateful. His quiet strength had given her something she hadn't realized. She needed permission to be vulnerable, to let down the walls she had built around herself for so long. As the evening wore on, the rain grew heavier, and the storm outside seemed to intensify. The wind howled against the cabin walls, but inside, the warmth of the fire and the soft glow of the lanterns made everything feel calm. Emily leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the day lifting off her shoulders. There was no rush to go anywhere, no pressure to do anything. She could simply sit here, in the presence of someone who cared, and let herself heal in her own time. The comfort of the moment wasn't lost on her. She realized, in that quiet stillness, that she hadn't felt like this in so long. The grief still lingered, just beneath the surface, but for the first time in months, she didn't feel consumed by it. It was as if Jake's presence had created a space where she could breathe again, where she could feel like she wasn't defined by her sorrow. For Jake, too, the evening felt different. It wasn't that he hadn't seen grief before. He had lived through his own share of loss. But there was something about Emily's quiet vulnerability that stirred something in him. He could see how much pain she was carrying, how much she had been trying to hold in. And in that moment, he knew what it felt like to be in her shoes. He had been there once, after his own heartache, when the world felt like it was spinning out of control. But there was something else, too. Something about Emily's strength, her quiet resilience, reminded him that there was still hope, still the possibility of healing. He had long since resigned himself to the idea that his past was something he would never truly escape. But Emily, she was different. She was still in the process of finding herself again. And maybe, just maybe, he could be part of that journey. Neither of them spoke about it out loud. But in the silence between them, something unspoken passed. It wasn't romantic, Not yet, but there was a deep understanding between them, a connection that neither of them had expected but both needed. The night stretched on, the storm outside continuing its fierce dance with the land. But inside the cabin, Emily felt a calmness she hadn't experienced in what felt like forever. For once, she didn't feel like she was walking through life alone. And for Jake, the presence of someone like Emily, a person who was so real, so raw, and so full of unspoken strength, was a reminder that the world still had moments of unexpected beauty. As the fire burned low and the night grew quieter, Emily found herself drifting off, her eyelids growing heavier with each passing minute. She felt safe, wrapped in the comfort of the cabin, and in the quiet presence of Jake, who had offered her something that had been missing from her life for so long, peace. And as she finally allowed herself to rest, she realized that maybe this was the first step toward healing, toward finding her way out of the darkness that had followed her for so long. As the days passed, the quiet connection between Emily and Jake deepened. They saw each other regularly after that night in the cabin, though neither of them spoke about the emotions that had been stirred up. It was almost as though they both understood that the healing process didn't need to be rushed or dissected, it just needed time and space to unfold naturally. Emily had started to feel lighter, a little less burdened, but the grief still lingered in the background. Not gone, but softened by Jake's steady presence. Emily had never expected to find solace in someone like Jake, a cowboy who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. His life was simple, filled with hard work and solitude, but there was a quiet wisdom in the way he carried himself. He didn't need to say much, yet everything he did spoke volumes, whether it was offering her a warm drink when she arrived at his cabin, or simply listening to her when she needed to talk. He made her feel understood, in a way that no one else had. It wasn't just his kindness, though. It was his ability to allow her to be herself, to feel the weight of her grief without rushing her to move on. So many people had tried to help her get over it, pushing her to pick up the pieces and move forward. But Jake never did that. He never asked her to pretend everything was okay. He simply offered her a space where she could grieve, and in doing so, he gave her a sense of peace that she hadn't realized she needed so badly. One afternoon, as the summer began to fade into fall, Emily took a walk by herself through the meadow near Jake's cabin. The air had a crispness to it, the kind of coolness that reminded her that the seasons were changing, and so too was her life. She had been coming to this spot more often in recent days, finding comfort in the rhythm of the wind in the trees and the quiet rustling of the grass beneath her feet. It was a place that seemed to mirror her own journey, calm, serene, yet still in the midst of change. As she walked, her mind wandered back to Adam. It still hurt. The loss of him. There was no denying that. But she realized that, for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel as though the pain was consuming her. She could remember the good times, the love they had shared, without feeling completely overwhelmed. She could think about the future without feeling trapped in her grief. And that was thanks, in large part, to Jake. She thought about their last conversation. Jake had listened to her talk about Adam, about the things they had planned to do together, and he didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice or try to fix things. He just let her speak. And somehow, that made all the difference. It had been the first time in months that she had been able to talk about Adam without feeling like it was too much for anyone to hear. As she walked deeper into the meadow, she noticed that the sky had darkened, and clouds were rolling in. It looked like rain was coming. Emily quickened her pace, hoping to get back to the cabin before the storm hit. She wasn't afraid of storms, but the wind had picked up, and she didn't want to get caught in the downpour. By the time she reached the edge of the meadow, the first drops of rain began to fall. Light at first, then quickly growing heavier. She turned around and started heading back, but the wind had picked up, making it harder to walk against it. She felt a chill run through her as the rain soaked into her clothes. She cursed under her breath, wishing she had brought a jacket. But the thought of running back to the cabin made her push forward, not wanting to admit that she had misjudged the weather. It wasn't long before she heard the sound of a horse's hooves pounding against the dirt road. She turned to see Jake riding toward her, his figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. He was heading straight for her, moving swiftly, despite the worsening weather. "Emily," he called out, his voice carried by the wind. "You need to get out of the rain." Before she could respond, Jake dismounted quickly, grabbing her arm gently and guiding her toward his horse. "Come on. I'll take you back to the cabin." Emily hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should accept his help. But the cold rain made her decision for her. She climbed onto the horse behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist to steady herself. As they rode back to the cabin, the storm intensified. The wind howled, and the rain poured down in sheets. But Emily felt a sense of comfort as she held onto Jake. The steady rhythm of the horse's hooves beneath them, the warmth of Jake's body in front of her. It was a moment of pure calm in the midst of the chaos. When they arrived at the cabin, Jake helped her off the horse and ushered her inside, where the warmth from the fire immediately wrapped around her like a blanket. She took a deep breath, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to melt away. It had been a long time since she had felt this safe, this cared for. And even though she didn't fully understand what was happening between them, she knew one thing for sure: Jake had become an anchor in her life. They both stood there for a moment, catching their breath, the storm raging outside. Emily could hear the sound of the rain pounding against the roof and the wind rattling the windows. But inside, it felt like the world had slowed down. She looked at Jake, her heart pounding in her chest, and she realized that something had shifted between them. There was an undeniable connection, one that neither of them had fully acknowledged until now. Jake turned to face her, his expression unreadable, and Emily's heart skipped a beat. She could see the concern in his eyes, the way he was looking at her not as a widow, not as someone defined by her grief, but as a person who had endured so much and was still standing. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice gentle. Emily nodded, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. She wasn't okay. Not in the way people usually understood it. She was still grieving, still processing, still healing. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to carry the weight of that alone. "I'm okay," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake stepped closer, his presence calming, steady. Without a word, he reached out and took her hand. A simple gesture, but one that made her heart race. The warmth of his hand in hers was grounding, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this moment. And, for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like maybe she could begin to let go of the pain, just a little bit, and trust that there was still love and connection to be found, even after everything she had lost. They stood there for a few moments, just holding hands, the weight of their shared experience hanging between them. Neither of them said anything, but there was an understanding in the air, a silent acknowledgement that this moment, this connection, was significant. It wasn't just about the storm outside or the fire in the hearth. It was about the two of them, finding a way through the darkness together. Finally, Jake spoke again, his voice soft and sincere. "You don't have to go through this alone, Emily. You never have to face it by yourself." His words pierced through the walls she had built up around herself. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, and saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't offering her a quick fix or a way to erase the pain. He was offering something much more important: his presence, his understanding, his willingness to walk beside her through the hard times. And in that moment, Emily realized that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Healing wouldn't happen overnight, and the grief would never truly disappear. But she also realized that she didn't have to face it alone anymore. With Jake by her side, maybe, just maybe, she could find her way back to herself, back to the person she had been before the pain had taken over. The storm outside continued to rage. But inside the cabin, Emily felt a sense of calm settle over her. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't afraid of the journey. The days that followed the storm felt different. For the first time in a long time, Emily woke up each morning with a glimmer of hope. The heavy weight of grief, which had clung to her for so long, still lingered, but it no longer felt as suffocating. She no longer felt as if the world was pressing down on her, as though she were drowning in the sorrow of losing Adam. There was a lightness in her heart, a small spark of something that had been buried for months, maybe even years. It was the first sign of healing. The change had been subtle at first. A few weeks ago, she would have struggled to leave her house, the thought of stepping out into the world feeling impossible. But now, when the morning light filtered through the trees and cast soft shadows on her porch, she found herself wanting to be outside, wanting to feel the warmth of the sun again. She had begun to take walks, sometimes alone, sometimes with Jake. Jake, who had been there for her when she needed him most, hadn't pushed her. He hadn't rushed her to move on or expected her to be something she wasn't. Instead, he had simply been there. A quiet presence in her life. A constant reminder that life could still be good, even after loss. He was the one person who had never judged her, never told her to stop grieving or to forget. He understood that the path to healing wasn't a straight line, that it was filled with setbacks and small victories. But more than anything, he understood that healing took time. One afternoon, as Emily sat on her porch, watching the world go by, Jake pulled up in his truck. She could see him from where she sat, his silhouette outlined against the bright blue sky. He waved as he parked, and Emily smiled in return. It had become their routine. Jake would stop by most days to check on her, to bring her a hot cup of coffee or simply to spend time together. It wasn't anything extraordinary, but it was exactly what she needed. Companionship without expectation. Today, Jake wasn't alone. He had brought a bouquet of wildflowers, the kind of flowers that grew in the fields near his cabin. Bright yellow sunflowers, purple lupines, and soft, white daisies. As he approached her, he smiled, holding the flowers out to her. "These just seem to fit," he said, handing them over. Emily took the flowers from him, feeling a rush of gratitude. She inhaled their fresh scent, the sweetness of the petals reminding her of the simplicity of life in the countryside. The kind of life she had once dreamed of before everything had changed. The gesture, so simple, yet so thoughtful, made her heart swell. "They're beautiful," she said softly, gazing down at the flowers in her hands. "I thought you might like them," Jake replied, his voice gentle. "They already have," Emily said, her smile genuine. She paused for a moment, looking up at Jake, seeing him in a new light. The man who had once seemed like nothing more than a quiet cowboy now felt like someone who had come to mean so much to her, someone she never expected to be a part of her life. Jake sat down next to her, the sound of the grass crunching under his boots as he lowered himself to the ground. For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply sat together, watching the sky shift colors as the sun began its descent into the horizon. The air was warm, and the peaceful quiet between them felt comfortable, soothing. Emily realized that, for the first time, she was no longer weighed down by her grief. It was still there, lurking in the background, but it no longer controlled her. There was more room for joy, for laughter, and for new memories. "Thank you for everything, Jake," Emily said after a long pause. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't quite sure how to express what she was feeling. "I don't think I would have made it through all of this without you." Jake looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, without saying a word, he placed a hand gently on hers. It was a simple gesture, but one that carried so much meaning. He didn't need to speak. His actions said everything. They had both been through their own battles, their own heartaches, and yet they had found a way to heal together, to offer each other comfort without rushing the process. "You don't have to thank me," Jake finally said, his voice low. "I'm just glad I could be here for you." For a moment, Emily felt overwhelmed by a wave of emotion. She had been so focused on her own pain, on her own loss, that she hadn't truly recognized how much Jake had quietly given her his support, his time, his presence. In the silence that followed, she realized just how much he had been a part of her healing. And more than that, she realized that she had started to feel something more for him, something that went beyond gratitude. As the evening wore on, the two of them continued to talk slowly, gently, without the heaviness of the past weighing on their words. They spoke about the future, about the things they still wanted to do. Jake talked about his plans for the ranch, about his dreams of expanding his land and raising more cattle. Emily listened, her heart swelling with admiration for his determination and resilience. He had taken his own pain and used it as fuel to build a better life. And she realized how much she respected that strength. In turn, Emily began to share her own hopes for the future. She spoke of traveling places she had always wanted to see, but never had the chance. She talked about the idea of finding a way to give back to the community, of helping others who had gone through similar losses. And, for the first time in a long time, she spoke with excitement, not sadness. The conversation gradually shifted, and though the topics were light-hearted, there was an underlying current of something deeper, something neither of them had dared to acknowledge before. There was a tenderness between them now, a bond that had grown out of shared vulnerability and mutual respect. Emily knew that this wasn't just a friendship, it was something more, something that had the potential to grow into something beautiful. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch, the stars began to appear in the sky, one by one. The moon was full, casting a soft glow over the landscape. The night was quiet, save for the sounds of nature, crickets chirping, the distant hoot of an owl. It was in this stillness that Emily felt something profound settle in her heart. She had come to Jake's cabin all those weeks ago, lost and grieving, unsure of how she would ever move forward. But now, as she sat beside him, she realized that she wasn't the same person she had been then. Healing was not a destination, it was a journey. And though it hadn't been easy, though there had been many painful moments along the way, she had started to heal. She still carried the scars of her past, but she no longer let them define her. She had learned that it was okay to feel sad, to grieve. But it was also okay to move forward, to embrace the new chapters that life had to offer. Jake looked at her then, his gaze steady and full of something unspoken. For a long moment, neither of them said anything, but in that silence, they both knew. They knew that they had come to a turning point, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, they were no longer walking it alone. The fire crackled softly in the background, and Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her, deep and quiet. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She had come through the storm, and while the pain of loss would always be a part of her, she now had a chance to live again. Jake stood up, offering his hand to her. She took it without hesitation, feeling the warmth of his touch, the strength in his grip, and together, they walked inside the cabin, ready to face whatever the future might bring. For Emily, it wasn't just about moving on from the past, it was about finding a way to live again. And with Jake by her side, she knew that healing was possible, that love and hope could bloom even in the most unexpected places.